Some biblical scholars consider that little sentence to be the very oldest example of a creed or confession in the Judeo-Christian tradition. It comes to us in Deuteronomy 26:5, but scholars believe that it was already ancient even by the time Deuteronomy was being put together. It may date back to the 12th century BCE or even earlier. In the context of Deuteronomy, it's a sentence that the Israelites are instructed to recite in worship as they present their offerings to God after having arrived in the land. My father was a wandering Aramean. So what does that mean? It's a statement designed to help remind the people of God who they are. The people of God are the children of a wandering Aramean, namely Abraham, whom God told to set out for an undisclosed land, a land that I will show you, as God put it. The authors of Deuteronomy sought to embed this short confession within the context of temple liturgy, so that even once the people of God had settled in a new homeland, they would never forget their history, that they come from a wanderer, a migrant, who set out by faith, who set out not knowing where he was going, who set out longing for a better country. This succinct creed expresses the identity of the people of God, but does so paradoxically as a sort of non-identity. Our homeland is precisely the act of wandering in search of a homeland. We are foreigners and exiles. We are in the world, but not of the world. We are heading for a land we know not where. It's like Jesus says to Nicodemus, the wind blows wherever it pleases. You hear its sound, but you cannot tell where it comes from or where it is going. So it is with everyone born of the Spirit. Our father was a wandering Aramean. Now, as we've seen week after week in this sermon series on Hebrews, the preacher of Hebrews is deeply influenced by the Old Testament. And that's obvious again this week as we read from Hebrews 11, in which the preacher gives this famous roll call of Old Testament figures who lived by faith. 18 biblical characters are mentioned by name, and many others are alluded to indirectly. Now, this is a long section that goes from Hebrews 11:1 all the way to 12:3. It's sometimes called the Hall of Faith. And for the sake of time, we're not going to read the entire thing, but feel free to pull it up on your phone if you want to look at it and fill in the gaps as I'm talking, that's fine. So hear now what the Spirit is saying to God's people. Now, faith is confidence in what we hope for, and assurance about what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. And by faith, even Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children, because she considered him faithful who had made the promise. And so from this one man, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as countless as the sands on the seashore. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for God has prepared a city for them. And what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, and Jephthah, about David and Samuel and the prophets who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. Women received back their dead, raised to life again. There were others who were tortured, refusing to be released so that they might gain an even better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were put to death by stoning. They were sawed in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains, living in caves and in holes in the ground. These were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised, since God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race that is set out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you may not grow weary and lose heart. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Tom Kiefer was a janitor at a U.S. Customs and Border Protection migrant processing facility in the tiny town of Ajo, Arizona, 30 miles from the Mexican border. This was the first stop for many undocumented border crossers who had been apprehended by Border Patrol in the Arizona desert. At this facility, a Border Patrol officer would confiscate from the migrants any belongings that were deemed to be non-essential or potentially hazardous. Theoretically, the migrants would be able to pick these items up at a later date, but in reality, many of them just wound up in the trash. Kiefer began to notice that the trash he emptied was full of personal items, things like photos, Bibles, rosaries. Disturbed, Kiefer began to retrieve these items from the trash. He collected thousands of items, and eventually he quit his job and became a full-time photographer, focusing on documenting the things that migrants carried, to honor the dignity of these items and the dignity of those who carried them along. And in your bulletin, you'll find one of his photos, which depicts just some of the many rosaries he collected from the trash. When I look at these rosaries, I see stories. Stories of setting out by faith. Stories of wandering across deserts and mountains. Stories of yearning for a city with foundations. Stories of an assurance of things not yet seen. Stories of looking forward to a city with foundations which God has prepared. I see stories of the children of a wandering Aramean. Because migration has always been a theological act, an act of hope, an act of love, and above all, an act by faith. Faith is the unrelenting drumbeat that powers Hebrews 11. The phrase by faith appears 18 times just in this section, and the word faith appears on its own 6 more times. The preacher starts slow, lingering on each named character that they mention at first, but they pick up the pace as they go until by the end you can almost see them pulling the hanky out of their back pocket and mopping their brow as they fly through the unsung trials of this great cloud of anonymous heroes of the faith. And as the tempo picks up, the preacher turns their attention from the saints of old to the saints in the room. The preacher connects the sufferings of the ancestors with the sufferings of the preacher's own persecuted and marginalized community of faith, tying them all together with this red thread of faith. I imagine that this preacher's words brought some in that congregation on that first reading to tears with their divine timeliness. Because then, as now, in 1,000 different ways, the world tries to tell wanderers that they are not worthy of this world. Walls, floating razor wire, discrimination, detention, family separation. But at this climactic moment of the Sermon of Hebrews, the preacher lays down what, in my opinion, has to be one of the most magnificent lines in the entire Bible. The preacher looks right at the jeered at, flogged, tortured, executed, destitute, persecuted, mistreated wanderers. And what is more, the preacher looks right at the oppressive logics that back then, just as now, systematically deem people unworthy of the world. And the preacher says, no. Actually, it's just the opposite. The world was not worthy of them. Isn't that magnificent? Now, our preacher is clear-eyed about the fact that migrant faith does not guarantee that everything is going to turn out all right. In fact, the preacher stresses that even these faith heroes of old died without having received the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. In 2021, a gunman motivated by racist and misogynistic stereotypes about Asian women opened fire at 3 different spas or massage parlors in the Atlanta area. He killed 8 people, including 6 women of Asian descent, most of whom were first-generation immigrants hustling toward an American dream. Biblical scholar Yi Jan Lin recalls what happened next in her own community. She writes, "The weekend after the shootings, the Asian Students Association at Yale Divinity School gathered in solidarity. Joining them as an Asian American woman, as their faculty, and as a biblical scholar, I cast about for what I could say. We did not know these women, and yet we knew them. Every person at that gathering could see them as their own mother or grandmother or auntie, and remember their own family and their own family stories about life in America." Struggling to find words, Dr. Lin found herself reaching for this ancient text of Hebrews 11. She proceeded to put together her own poetic reimagining of this text, a reimagining that centers the experiences of these working-class immigrant mothers, grandmothers, and aunties. So now I'd like to read you a portion of Dr. Lin's reimagining of Hebrews 11. "By faith, our auntie set out for this place in hopes to receive it as an inheritance. And she set out not knowing where she was going. By faith, she went to this land, living in a basement apartment, living at the spa where she worked, living with strangers who were heirs with her of the same promise. For she had faith in the home she was making. By faith she cradled and fed her children and the children of her sisters. Therefore this woman, one whom many would deem as good as dead, became a star of heaven. All of these died in faith without seeing the promises fulfilled. But from a distance, they saw them and welcomed them. They were labeled as strangers and foreigners in this land. For people who speak this way do not understand the real homeland. If our elders, our grandmothers and aunties and mothers had thought that they were innately foreign, without belonging promised to them, they would have returned where they began. But as it is, they had faith in a different homeland. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God. Indeed, God has prepared this home for them. And what more should I say? Lynn continues. For time would fail me to tell of Wong Kim Ark, Dosan An Chong Ho, Grace Lee Boggs, Fred Korematsu, Ibrahim Chowdhury, of Silme Domingo and Jean Viernes, of Yuri Kochiyama, of Patsy Mink, of Teresa Hak Kyung Cha, and all our prophets, who through faith marched together, demanded justice, and shut the mouths of the corrupt. They lit fires for their dead. Others were tortured, others were spat upon and knifed, others suffered chains and the seizure of their lands. They were lynched, they were splashed by acid, and they were beaten to death, and they were raped. They went about exploited, mocked, ignored. The world was not worthy of them. Yet all these, though they lived by faith, did not receive the full promise, and the promise will not be fulfilled apart from us and our working together toward justice. This week, I invite you to put that rosary photo up somewhere where you'll see it, maybe a bathroom mirror or a fridge door. And when you see it, say a prayer for all those who set out by faith without knowing where they're going, all those who long for a better country, all those who are persecuted and mistreated and made to feel like strangers and foreigners. The world is not worthy of them, but what is more, by faith, our liberty is bound up with theirs. Because just like them, our father was a wandering Aramean. Amen.